I want to thank you for inviting me to give a talk on my favorite place, the Valley. And I'd like to share with you why I became interested in the natural history in the first place. It comes from a childhood insecurity and an inferiority complex, actually. I grew up in a place south of here, of course, Tulare, and I had many relatives that live along the coast. And when we'd visit, I remember as a little boy, they'd say, "You're from where?" That valley, that place where you want to speed up and get through, the place you drive through to go to Sequoia or Yosemite. You know, it's just, and I remember feeling defensive about it. And I began searching for attributes, how to grandstand in front of my relatives about, hey, we're pretty neat, Bob Matthias, you know, and things like this. And lo and behold, I ran into all kinds of marvelous notorieties of the great Central Valley of California. I learned that it nurtured the densest populations of Native Americans north of the Valley of Mexico. I quickly learned that it's the most productive cornucopia of agriculture on Earth. And I also heard stories about great herds of antelope and elk, and incidences where people ran into grizzly bear near Bakersfield. And I couldn't believe it. And I remembered people talking about the skies being clouded with waterfowl, of great marshes, of mink and beaver, and oak groves that the wagons couldn't get through. And I went, where are these things? Where are these things? In fact, there was kind of a dichotomy in my life that I had a hard time reconciling. My dad would say, we're going to go see nature, and we'd drive to the mountains. Right? My next door neighbor, a very, very old gentleman who was born in Tulare County in the 1870s, he was 90-odd years old, and he was telling me about all these marvelous things in the valley, and I kept looking for souvenirs, remnants, residuals, and of that former glorious era of diversity. And these childhood fascinations and defensiveness have changed and, I guess, evolved into an academic fascination that's rationalized my study of geography, specifically historical geography. And tonight, my topic, of course, is vanishing landscapes. And as Gerald Haslam shared with you, it comes to many people's surprise that the great Central Valley of California is one of the most modified landscapes on the entire Earth. And what I would like to share with you is an approach that I'll describe in just a moment on how geographers who specialize in the study of human alteration, how they would approach a study like the Valley, but this approach can be used anywhere on the face of the Earth. In just a moment, when I was driving up here on I-5 this morning, great scenic I-5 from San Luis Obispo, I was remembering the comments of my relatives. Unfortunately, most of them are dead, and I'd like to get back to them now, because I'm a super patriot about this region, the Great Central Valley. I was driving up here. I was going through what I know about the natural attributes. In other words, the forces that govern the natural ecology of the valley, the basic forces. Obviously, there are worlds upon worlds upon worlds here. But I was looking at just the basic processes, and I imagined this landscape being in the Middle East somewhere, or in Europe. And I think that if this was in the old world, you know, this valley that's 400 miles long, averaging 50 miles wide, flanked by a great mountain range, positioned in a place that gives us the unique winter rainfall, and summer drought with a lot of sunshine. But this kind of environment in the old world, meaning the Middle East or Europe, would be something you'd be reading in your Western civilization books. You'd probably be reading about this as a crucible of civilization, hearth of culture. This environment, if you can imagine it superimposed over Europe or the Middle East, would be unmatched. The various things it has going for it. And it's just circumstances that it hasn't ended up perhaps creating civilizations that have modified the world. And we think of Mesopotamia and the Nile, places like that that gave birth to what is sometimes said to be the origins of Western civilization. The foundation of those civilizations were indeed geographical petri dishes in the sense that they're very, very rich ecologically. And so is our valley, and I would maintain probably more so. Now, the societies that this valley nurtured, specifically the Native American societies like the Yokuts in the San Joaquin Valley, they are a great culture, and they're very sophisticated. It was just unfortunate that most of them were cold and removed from this crucible before we could really understand the intricacies and the sophistication of their cultures and what they could have taught us. I'm just thinking that this is the first time I had this thought that I'd like to compare this environment with Mesopotamia sometime in terms of comparative landscapes, and I think there's no place on earth that has responded so well to the attentions of human beings as the Central Valley. So many different things have occurred here, and this valley has proven time and time again to come up with not only the natural resources, but the human resources to overcome adversity and to succeed and to prosper. Indeed, a petri dish. However, I think it's folly to think that this valley will go on forever, responding so favorably to our intentions. Because we have examples in the Middle East and elsewhere, if I refer back to these old cultural hearths, where societies have, not on purpose of course, have removed their capabilities for progress and sustenance by using land use practices that are incompatible with the environment. Now, they're not doing it on purpose, but you probably have heard stories about the ancient Sumerians and the problems with salinization in Mesopotamia, and how economic practices have actually contributed, if not led, to the downfall of many civilizations. They're nurtured for a long time, and they're very lush and rich, and eventually it gives out. We're very, very lucky to have one of the most fertile zones on the face of the earth, and yet, how long can it go on producing? What I'm going to do today is talk about the natural ecology or the natural environment of the valley. However, I hope you can go along with this assumption because I include people as part of the natural history. Human beings have been indelibly intertwined with the natural history of this region for at least 10 to 11,000 years. And I talk about the natural history, and I don't divorce it from human beings because obviously human beings have interrelated with this environment, have been influenced by this environment, and indeed have changed it. An approach that geographers often use, and this is very simplified and it's an abstract approach. I just want to give you the abstraction, then I'll try to flesh this out with some realities of the valley, is we'll often look at societies all around the world and try to look for what's the most important aspects of culture that tends to bring change to a land, to a natural setting. And there are many things that can initiate change on the landscape, but as we look around the world, we find some common denominators, and we find that population, technology, and attitude are perhaps the three strongest determinants of altering the natural environment. These are just components of human culture, of course. The weight of human numbers. You know, humans all need nutrition and shelter and a decent environment to reproduce in, and we're going to be nurtured by that environment. Populations do not change their environment equally because some peoples have tremendous amounts of energy and technology at their disposal. Others don't have so much, and so their impact is not so great. It's probably fortunate that every society doesn't change the environment as much as it could. We're very, very strong agencies of change. and we have been for thousands and thousands of years. I'm talking about the human species. Something tends to filter how much impact we have on the natural environment. And one of the most important filters that regulates our impact is our environmental attitude. We have the capacity to denude the Sierra Nevadas in a couple of years, but we don't. And there are many reasons why we don't, but one that I would suggest as a contribution is an environmental attitude. And of course, attitude can be conditioned by religion, it can be conditioned by education, it can be conditioned by upbringing, all kinds of different things. We also know that there are other aspects of culture, like laws and things like this, and government, that can have an impact upon the environment too. For instance, even religion, in a sense, when the Chinese adopted Buddhism, they adopted cremation. Forests began to disappear faster because of the need for fuel wood. We might use an example of a change in the law in the San Joaquin Valley, like water subsidies. Does that political fiat or change in the law does it ripple down to the environment? We'll see that it does. So there are many other things, but these three seem to be the most important determinants of change. Now, in any given geographic location, it will vary in terms of their impact. There is a rule of thumb, however, that we see around the world, and I'd like to demonstrate that the valley shows us both. And one rule of thumb in studying environmental alteration is that populations and technologies that evolve in situ in a place for a long period of time and cope and adapt to a place for over a long period of time tend to unleash fewer changes. For instance, if we had a certain kind of economy, and often we talk about economies as a technology, blend of technology and population, a way of making a living. If we take a way of making a living in Europe over thousands of years, up to the Middle Ages, there were some fairly sound land use practices used there for Europe. Yeah, and there were a lot of defeats and a lot of successes, but yet, you know, you can go to Europe today and you still see fields being farmed after thousands of years. But those practices are fairly well adapted to that landscape because they evolved there in situ. However, if you remove a European agricultural practice to the Amazon, you get tremendous change. And we see that all around the world. When you take one economic system, you know, in composing population, technology, and attitude, and superimpose it very rapidly to a new place, we see dramatic acceleration of environmental change, change that often affects the waters, the soils, the air, everything. In the valley, of course, we have both examples. We are citizens of the latter. You know, there was a society here, many societies in the valley. I'm talking about the Native Americans, the Yokuts in this vicinity. We evolved in situ. In other words, they changed their technologies. They adapted their culture. The population grew as they discovered more and more capacities of the valley, became intimately related to the valley's varied landscapes and resources. And their settlement was pretty much conditioned by that relationship. The more they became in tune with their environment, there was a demographic response. The numbers went up. There was a reward. Over thousands of years, a fair degree of codependence. I shouldn't use that word. Let's say a fair degree of harmony between the environment and the people. Now, of course, our example is, though, of bringing a new society, a new religion, a new technology, and new people, and imposing it upon this landscape. And we're going to see an acceleration of the change. And what I'd like to do, of course, is simply devote the rest of this hour to finding the processes that are important, keying on the processes that tend to be important in transforming this valley where the smooth harmonies of nature had supported one of the densest populations north of the Valley of Mexico. What were the processes that changed that condition to the valley that we have today, that is the richest agricultural landscape on Earth? I want to emphasize those processes more than the attributes of the natural environment, because most of the attributes are gone. And I'd like to try to see if we can learn from our losses. The valley is so changed, we've lost most of it. Oh yeah, there is nature out there, just breathe. But I want to learn from it. I want to, as we go through this story, and we'll go through time pretty rapidly, I'd like to focus on those parts of the environment that responded so favorably to us. And then look at some of the inherent dangers, too. Not because I'm a tree hugger, but because I want my children to live here, too, and to be able to prosper. You'll change your landscape. The Yokits change their landscape. You'll pass a landscape down to your children and their children. But there's precedent before us where no longer is a productive landscape passed down. We, because of our cerebral wiring, can make sure we can pass something down if we learn from the remnants of the natural environment and also learn from the casualties that we've incurred upon the natural systems here. We can learn from those losses. We can learn from the ghost of the past. Now let's do this. And how I'm going to do it is I'm going to, first of all, talk about some of the broad processes that govern the ecology of the valley as a whole. Then I'm going to take you to Tulare and look at it in a sub-regional approach. In other words, we're going to look at the interrelationship between human beings and a portion of the valley. Some of you are going, no, Tulare. But I'd like to remind you that the processes that I'll be addressing definitely are applicable to the rest of the valley. Sometimes they occurred earlier elsewhere, sometimes they occurred later, but they're applicable. You'll be getting a case study, essentially, but I'm going to try to emphasize the processes that affect the whole.
Pardon me, could we turn the first lights off so we can see this?
I'm sorry, of course.
Thank you.
I'd like to encourage you as I'm talking that if you do have good criticisms like that, to please speak up, or if you have something that can contribute to what I'm saying, I have no problem with that. In fact, we'll make the whole question moot by doing this. Okay. Jeff, that's the last slide. Thank you. Can you all see that? You want me to turn down the lights more? Okay. Okay. All right. Now, despite geographical literacy for everybody outside the Central Valley, you all know where this is. And I wanted to give you a geographic approach. One of the basic controls for the natural environment here is geographic position. You know, we're very lucky to be occupying a valley that lies in the westerly wind belts. You know, basically our storms come from the west. And in the mid-latitudes, where we allow generally, if it's not another drought year, which it seems fortunately not to be, allows winter storms to come in during the winter, which is very unique worldwide. And also during the summer, it's a time of drought because a high pressure system descends over this part of the country, the western slope. And we get several months of great sunshine. And of course, that sunshine is where all of the energy that's going to run all the ecosystems, you know, originates. Another aspect of geography is proximity. In other words, position or nearness. Again, position in the westerlies proves important, but also in this case, position between two mountain ranges of different elevations as well as different components. Now, this is a geological map, the kind when you run into a map like this in your textbook, you turn the page immediately. It looks like a collage of chaos there. However, what I just want to emphasize here on the west, of course, is the Coast Range, a low-lying Coast Range that used to be sea sediments, you know, shale and limestone and things like this, as opposed to our great ranges to the east, much higher. The Sierra Nevadas made up more granitic material. Now, of course, over long periods of time, these materials have both been washed into the valley, giving us an unusual mixture of soil components that are extremely productive to certain kinds of land uses. However, they also have their problems. We'll address those later. This is a cross-section you all have seen. This is to the west, of course, is are the Coast Ranges. To the east, the Sierra Nevada. I'd like to remind you of something, though, because the Sierra Nevadas are higher. They have the ability to capture more of the snow and precipitation out of our passing winter storms, and so we're going to have more runoff coming from the Sierra Nevada. And what happens is the spent residues, the residues of land and life, meaning silt, organic matter, and sand, mostly comes from the Sierra Nevadas, and we have this asymmetrical valley. Most of the valley, especially towards the east, is filled with Sierra sediments. In the west, an apron right along the western edge of the Coast Range in the valley itself, running north-south, is made up principally of sediments that come from the Coast Range. What I meant by the asymmetrical part of the valley, the axis, the lowest part of the valley, is not exactly in the center. It's over here. Okay. Now, another map that often has a page turned on it. This is rainfall. The valley, my relatives used to always talk about that homogeneous. Of course, they couldn't pronounce that word. The valley being all the same. You know, it's just that part that's all the same from Redding to Bakersfield. And of course, it's not. But it does have some things in common. You know, because it does lie in the rain shadow of the Coast Range, meaning the Coast Range blocks some of the moisture that would have come here otherwise. We have a couple of patterns that prove important for helping to determine the natural ecology. In other words, there is an intimate relationship between moisture and soils and plants and animal habitats. We find two patterns in the valley that are worth remembering. It's drier in the west, the western portion of the valley, and also the north, because it's closer to the average pathways of cyclonic storms. It's wetter than the south. Up there near Red Bluff, you'll have 24 inches of rain. You and Modesto get about 13 or 14 inches. Then you go down to a true desert, Bakersfield, with about 6 inches of rain. Of course, that moisture that has come in, I did this on purpose. I put it on its side. You're a cyclonic storm headed for California now, off the Pacific. Now, this is very important because it's just, again, one of those wonderful, wonderful outcomes of physical geography. Whereas the valley gets very little rain compared to the rest of the state. In the summertime, it gets hardly any. But of course, we have the great catchment basin of the Sierra Nevadas that piles up tremendous quantities of snow. Then when we have our high pressure and the period of drought during the late spring, summer, and early fall, when the sun is the most intense, meaning the potential energy in the valley is the most, the valley is watered because the snow melts and flows into these spots. And you got sunny skies and a virtual morass. Now I'm talking about days before the engineering constraints of human beings changed it. And this just shows the rivers mainly coming out of the Sierras flowing into the valley. However, the photo before this was a geography of the present. This is a geography of the past. And this has bearing on today's conditions and has bearings on the potential of the valley today. What this is a snapshot or window back on the Ice Age, only about 10,000 years ago, when the Sierras were capped with a great alpine glacier, and the valley was a chief drain for those glaciers, and much of the valley was filled with huge lakes. Now, this particular pattern in the south represents a pattern of a lake that fluctuated in size, oscillated in size with glacial advances and great glacial retreats. Nevertheless, for the most of the last 2 million years, the Central Valley had a Great Lake in it, and it varied in size, and this we now refer to it as a Corcoran Lake. Now, the reason I'm talking about this is the clay that drifted to the bottom of this lake over long periods of time is a very compact, very, very fine clay, and it has since been buried by more recent alluvium. And believe it or not, the subterranean geology of that old ghost remnant of a lake is going to have bearing on today's economic prospects of the valley and in the past as well. Coming back to, see the hand of man up there. This is, sorry about that, but coming back to the hydrology. Now the water flowed into the valley. This is a reconstruction of the aquatic habitats that most people don't realize were here before rivers were diverted, swamps drained, and things like that. Really quite the Garden of Eden, because he had water in the hottest part of the year, which allows so much potential. In fact, when my father said, let's go see nature in the Sierra Nevadas, in actuality, the Sierra Nevadas never, ever came close to the biomass that inhabited the valley. In other words, it was just nothing. We had a flat landscape, full of water, full of sunshine, and in a comparative sense, if we could reconstruct the natural habitats of the valley and compare it with Sierra National Forest, for instance, there'd be no comparison. In terms of species diversity, in terms of the biomass produced per acre, the valley would have it all over. You know, there's aquatic animals, terrestrial animals, things like this. It's hard to drive on the 99 between Fresno and Bakersfield and convince somebody of that, however, but I try. Okay. This is a map of climate. This is a climate classification map, and I wanted to end with this because it should be sobering. I talked earlier about comparing the valley, the Central Valley, with crucibles or cauldrons in which great civilizations had originated in the Old World, like along the Indus and along the Tigris-Euphrates and along the Nile. And they all had something in common. They were arid. And they also all had something else in common. The underlying economic base was irrigated agriculture. And they all had something else in common. Their potential productivity plummeted because of the combination of irrigation in an arid and semi-arid environment and the problems that eventually resulted from that. We do have their lessons, and also we have an ongoing process in the valley today that we have to address, but most people are wearing blinders in reference to it. Remember, we have occupied a desert, especially in the southern portion. It is a desert. And no matter how much we try to divorce our lives from that fact or our livelihoods, it remains a desert. And no matter how many of us become urbanites and work in the service industry instead of agriculture, we still depend upon that resource base. And I'm talking about the natural environment. We're not divorced from it. In fact, we're more dependent upon it than ever. But on a day-to-day basis, so few of us engage with it, I don't think we realize that sometimes. Now, take you on a tour of a valley within a valley, actually a basin within a valley. And what I've done is, as you go south from here, this area that I've blown up depicts the region between Bakersfield, which would be to the south, and Fresno, which would be to the north. These are the flat portions of Tulare and Keenes counties today. And it's more than just a parcel of the Great Central Valley, because there are some differences here. This is sometimes called the Tulare Lake Basin. And some people do call it a valley within a valley because due to tectonic downwarping, this region south of Fresno is basically a depression in the San Joaquin Valley and a region that has what's called internal drainage. In other words, any kind of water that enters the valley north of the ruler here will end up flowing out to the sea, but any of the water generally flowing into this part of the valley, because of the depression, stays there. This is going to offer some unique opportunities to humans, but also some problems as well. I'd like to quickly show you what I meant about the intimate relationship between moisture and also the natural ecologies, meaning vegetation and animal habitats. This is a reconstruction of that region I just showed you, the Tulare Lake Basin, and showing the pattern of moisture, which is duplicated all up and down the valley, basically drier in the west because of the rain shadow effect, and then moisture increasing as we go east towards the foothills of the Sierra Nevadas, in this case, a gradient ranging from 4 inches of rain, 4 to 6 inches of rain, up to 14. Now that pattern, of course, is going to be displayed on another geographic pattern. And of course, we're going to see the hydrology of the basin. This is a reconstruction of the hydrology of that region. Again, Visalia would be here, Tulare would be here, so on and so forth. The cultural hearth of Corcoran, right here. Some of you have never been there, evidently, or you wouldn't let me get away with that. Kettleman City? Yeah, all right. Kettleman City. Very, very, very different. Now, of course, what we have is this depression, this lozenge within the valley where all these rivers would dump their discharge. The Kings River in the north coming down, and the Kaweah and the Tule and Deer Creek and White River. Now south of here is the Kern River, and it too flowed north into the Tulare Lake. In an interesting environment, of course, because the spring runoff and the summer runoff was very, very large, and often, more often than not, the lake would eventually get so large it would overflow the ridge built by the Kings River fan here, and this lake would get much larger than is depicted here and overflow into the San Joaquin. And of course, this only lasted for a few months, but evidently it has been going on so long during the Pleistocene that it would allow fish in from the sea, sturgeon, steelhead, as well as salmon. If you can imagine salmon near Kettleman City, but they do find the bones there. So not only do we have this internal hydrology, but we have an hydrology where periodically it's connected to a greater realm, meaning the oceans and the rivers of Northern California. Again, I wanted to remind you of the cross-section. We saw it earlier. This is a duplication on a smaller scale. Sierras on the east. This is the cross-section of the Tulare Lake Basin. Here's Tulare Lake. And the coast range here, the axis of the valley in the west. What I want to point out is the remnant, or the residual from the Great Corcoran Lake that I alluded to that was around during the Pleistocene. And there's the old lake bed below the surface, ranging from 40 to 50 feet deep, in some places to several hundred feet. But underneath that part of the valley is a great lens, and here's the key word. It's impermeable. It's impermeable, meaning that water tends to perch on top. But that impermeable lens also will capture infiltrated water that comes from the Sierras in this loose alluvium. By the way, this is all loose alluvium, meaning it's not been metamorphized into rock, and so water can filtrate and comes under, and this is going to create some interesting ecological conditions that have benefited and also sabotage some human attempts to utilize this region. The reconstruction of the vegetation, without going into it in depth, the basic control here, of course, was the rainfall, and we see a loose zonation of habitats. If we start the Sierra foothills, sort of an oak park woodland, if you will, with numerous species of oaks and grasslands. As we move out into the drier realm, we have the drier prairies, the original grasslands of California, of course, bunch grasses, perennial bunch grasses, more than the introduced annuals or even the native annuals. As we move further out, we get into more xeric, or species that have to adapt to more arid conditions, saltbush, saltgrass, pickleweed. But then we have another lush zone, which is a marsh zone that is around the lakeshore. And this would be composed of the tules and bulrushes and things like that. This north-south zonation is pretty much controlled by moisture, but it's going to be crossed by non-repetitive environments along the streams. You know, the riparian environments characterized by not only oak, but willows and berries of various kinds, and as well as sycamores and cottonwoods and so on and so forth. Now these environments, even though when you go south it gets drier, up here you're used to having oak trees, maybe go all the way across the valley, but down there you hardly see them way out in the valley near Hanford and Lemoore anymore, but there were dense oak forests at that time, and one of the reasons was, of course, the water hadn't been diverted, but also the groundwater, which is an important component here. The groundwater was very, very high. Also, something about this lake, it was very shallow. Huge lake, one time the largest lake west of the Mississippi. However, it's very, very shallow, never more than 40 feet deep, and that's the richest kind of lake you want. The reason is, of course, the sun can hit the bottom of the lake. And it was just this teeming menagerie of fish and other resources, 11 different species of fish, terrapin, turtles, mink, beaver, almost everything you can think of inhabited this place. I mentioned position earlier. Fortunately, the basin, as well as the rest of the Central Valley, is right beneath the Pacific Flyway, meaning that there are airborne species that visit here. This area, as well as most of the valley, as you know, was constantly being visited by waterfowl. Almost every season, we had landings and nesting and reproducing and leaving, and there was a tremendous flyway brought to these marshlands. Many of these species would fly from the Arctic clear down into the southern hemisphere and back. Tremendous resource for humans, of course. We always, in biology as well as in physical geography, allude to what controls or what determines the pattern of animals, and you all know it's going to be the vegetation. You know, that's going to be the habitat for animals, and this is taken off of a mural that the Great Valley Museum has a copyright to. Thank you. You can purchase one on the way out as well. In fact, there is literature on reconstruction of the way the valley habitats used to look. It's a very beautiful depiction. This just shows the eastern portion of the valley and the various critters that used to be there, and the enormity of the menagerie that was in the valley, on the valley floor, is just enormous. Herds of elk, herds of antelope, deer, bears of two different types, wolves, mink, foxes, rabbits galore, mosquitoes, and many other critters. I'm not going to go into detail because we'll be talking about the disappearance of these creatures, but it just seems so incongruous now when you drive from Bakersfield to Fresno to think that there were more animals here than in the Sierras because the vegetation was richer in the valley than in the Sierras. But now you have to drive to Sequoia to see some of the remnants of these animal species. Or drive to Buttonwillow. Another cultural hearth there near Bakersfield. There is a reserve of elk with a few tules. They're pinned up like so many remnants of our natural environment. If you want to see them, you have to go to some pen or museum or special locale, because we have not integrated many of the components of the valley into our lives. In fact, we've done everything but. We've divorced ourselves from them. I'm just hoping that I can convince you tonight that keeping them around and at least making their demise work for us. I'm very ethnocentric, or I should say human-oriented here. I want it for our benefit. The first occupiers. Evidence suggests that the valley in general was perhaps first peopled 10,000 years ago. These, of course, were the ancestors of the people that were encountered by the first European explorers that came into the valley, Spanish and Americans coming in from the east. The people that first came into the valley, of course, brought technologies from elsewhere. You know, they appeared to be 10,000 years ago big game hunters. Of course, they collected and harvested forage for other things as well, but these are the people that you perhaps have read about that had projectile points. They were quite sophisticated. They had fire. And they came into the valley and basically emphasized big game along the lake shores, along the swamps and the sloughs, along the valley and along Tulare Lake. They may have played a role in the extinction of some of the animals. There were mastodons, great beaver and short-faced bear in the valley and things like that disappeared. By about 6,000 years ago, there were none left. There is a suggestion that perhaps human predation may have helped push some of these animals to extinction along with climate change. Nevertheless, either newcomers or an evolution of these folk, in other words, after thousands of years, the people that stayed here, the native Californians, coped and adapted to the environments of the Tulare Lake Basin as well as to the rest of the valley, and came up with a means of making a living that was excellent. And I say excellent because demographically, the population density of the San Joaquin Valley and Sacramento Valley is unmatched in North America, even by agricultural peoples of the Southeast. You can run into those densities, reconstruction of the demography, you can run into those densities, but you have to go down to the Valley of Mexico. Now, many people have argued this point, but I'll hold it up to your own scrutiny. You've got an expert coming in next week on native Californians, but that notoriety that I was so proud of when I was a child, of having, you know, the densest populations of Native Americans, is because of the environment. You know, of course, they lived directly off the environment. They did not use agriculture. They were foragers, and it was an extremely rich environment, and they were extremely intimately related to it. They knew what they were doing, of course, in terms of hunting animals, in terms of gathering fish and ducks and plants, and of course the ubiquitous acorns. These are some population estimates that surprised many, many people, the reconstructions, and I think this is pretty low. Of course, the valley is not homogeneous. It's not equal in terms of its productivity for us, nor was it equal from spot to spot for the native Californians. And the native Californians, the demography reflected the different carrying capacities or the productivity of each region. The natives that lived here, though, lived more lightly on the land than we did. They lived, in, I think that no other term says it best, but more harmoniously. However, they did not come up with a formula where they could live off the land without changing it. There are some common denominators to all human beings. We tend to change the environment, not on purpose. Remember, these were peoples that had a society, had a civilization, had waste products, had to make a living. They altered the environment for that purpose. But we also have to remember that the Yokuts of the Tulare Lake Basin, as well as the native Californians in general, believed themselves as part of the environment. They believed in their ideals that spirituality extended from them into the soil, into the rock, into the deer. They believed in a cyclical existence, not a beginning and end. Everything is recycled. They would not ascend to heaven. They would end up back here in the nest. And in other words, that's their belief. Those were their ideals. They were animistic, if you will. And many people believe that this attitude helped them immeasurably, not only economically, but also environmentally, in the sense that it meant that they stayed away from overexploitation as much as possible. Because your spirit is no better than Bambi's, okay? You will eat Bambi, but you'll placate the spirit left behind. Now, there's always a discrepancy between environmental ideals and religious ideals and behavior. Always a discrepancy, but I aspire to the ideals of the native Californians, specifically the Yokuts. However, I realize that they were humans, and I'm not going to trivialize them by saying they didn't change the environment. They did. They used fire. They used fire in every one of these landscapes to increase productivity in both the foraging for herbs and forbs and for animals. They replanted things, tobacco. They may have hunted things, animals, to local extinctions. Their numbers were very, very high in terms of human numbers, and probably in many aspects they did diminish the diversity in some regions of the basin. However, through their use of fire, in other areas they may have increased the diversity. They believed in surpluses. They weren't willing just to live off the land and the vagaries of nature and the Garden of Eden. They worked that land. They worked it in a different way than we do, but they knew what they were doing. They put fire to it in order to increase the amount of food that they could get from it and other resources. And in doing so, of course, they're going to change it. Well, of course, not too long ago, people with different environmental attitudes came to the Tulare Lake Basin and the valley in general. I'm talking about the arrival of the Hispanics and also the American fur trappers. Specifically, there were interlopers here prior to 1769, but after the establishment of the mission in San Diego and the beginning of the construction of the 21 missions on the coast, more and more of the Hispanic presence, both during the Spanish era as well as in the Mexican era, began to be felt in the valley. This was not a focus of their settlement. This, and by the way, is a map, an early Spanish map, and what they perceived to be in the valley. And notice that they turned it into a great morass, the word Tule up there. However, they did have an effect. These were people that did not believe that they were part of nature. They were the chosen ones. They were the receptors of a monotheistic religion that focused on the human being, gave the human being dominion over the earth. Spirituality was not seen to extend into the redwood tree, into the grass, into the beaver. These are also people that brought their perceptions of what is worth exploiting from a different land, from Europe. They came to the valley, they came to the basin with different perceptions of what the resources were. They saw the native Californian, the Yokuts, as a resource. They also looked upon the valley as a great pasture. There were some attempts, especially up here in the north, to colonize the valley to one effect or another. In the south, there were very, very few ranchos. However, their effect, their impact, the impact of the Hispanic period, 1769, let's say, to the 1830s, was tremendous upon the valley. We're going to accelerate the simplification of the environment. How do we do this? First of all, Hispanic, as well as some of the American fur-bearers and some of the other foreigners that came into the valley, were responsible for the destruction of the Yokuts almost entirely. The biggest destroyer, of course, was disease. The introduction of exotic pathogens that people didn't have any immunity to. Now, don't get me wrong, the valley was not a disease-free paradise prior to the Spanish. However, there was no such thing as pneumonia, tuberculosis, measles, smallpox, etc. And it just decimated the populations almost overnight. Another thing that occurred, of course, was the Spanish took Yokuts from the valley to flush out the dying populations in the missions as workers and as people to be saved. Also, feral animals, or herds of wild horses and cattle, and in some cases some hogs, were grazed near the western edge of the Tulare Lake Basin, and they caused tremendous change in the ecosystem. Not only did they disrupt the remaining Indians' food supplies, but they also began to disrupt, for instance, the bunch grasses that didn't evolve in situ with grazing animals like cows. And the bunch grasses were almost eliminated, and by about the 1830s, most of the valley was already beginning to sprout European annual grasses like oats and fillery. People that came to the valley called it the natural grasslands, but it's pretty evident, pretty understood today. Before the gold rush, most of the valley grasslands were altered, and this comes as a consequence of interlopers coming from the outside, accidental introductions, of course, and also grazing by different species of animals. These were some of the approach routes of the Hispanics and American fur-bearers. One group of people came down from British Columbia. They came to Tulare Lake and the rivers nearby, and in 2 seasons took out 10,000 beaver alone, and the mink as well. They took out 10,000 beaver and mink, and there were also river otter that were taken as well. Already tying this region into the international economy, because these pelts were sold. Tallow from the cows that were sometimes harvested were taken around the world. The valley was being tied into extra-regional processes, decisions made elsewhere in Europe, market decisions, fads for fur caps would have an effect upon the ecology of the valley. This is a trend that's continued to accelerate to this very, very day. Now, of course, one aspect of the natural ecology by about 1856 was almost entirely removed, and this, of course, with the Yokuts. Some remnant population of Yokuts, I'm just showing the removal. Remember, they're part of the natural ecology. They have been culled. They have been harvested. They are gone. And of course, this is going to have disruptions that we can't even reconstruct, because for thousands of years, their economic practices were part of the rhythm of nature, and their removal It's going to change everything. There's still remnants, of course, the legacies of the Yokuts in about the valley, mainly on the edges of the valley. These are bedrock mortars showing an old adaptation. This is near Exeter in Tulare County. Old adaptation to an acorn-based staple diet. We still get glimpses of their life through petroglyphs and paintings such as this showing tule huts and whatnot. What a loss. What a loss. A people that was intimately associated to the environment. A people whose population growth reflected their intimacy to the environment. They did very well, but their time had ended and new peoples have come. The Hispanics came to take the resources. As part of manifest destiny, the Americans come and they intend to settle. Now, of course, this is a map of Fremont's map. There were many people coming into the valley that preceded early settlement. These people came in, geographers among them, to assess the potential of the Great Valley, in this case, the southern end of the valley, for American settlement, part of manifest destiny. They sent out reports, and it varied according to the season that they visited the valley. If they came during August, often they were negative reports. If they came during January, often it was negative reports because of fog. But they basically perceived the wet zones as being the most important. But they did watch the Americans that came in, like Fremont, did notice the wild cattle. They did notice the European annuals. And especially in this southern portion, they thought that the best use of the valley would be as a great pasture. This is before the gold rush. And of course, the gold rush is going to stimulate that economic expansion of grazing animals in the valley. Something else came with the American occupation. When California entered the Union in 1850, by nature of its entering the Union, it was obligated, it fell under the laws of the United States of America, which means it's going to be surveyed with the system that's used in the United States of America, the Township and Range Survey System, a superimposition of a grid over the land. What I mean is surveying the land out into blocks. And people don't like to think in these terms, but Little House on the Prairie with Michael Landon was basically wrong. 90% of the West was surveyed first before the colonizers came. This part of the valley was surveyed. This area up here was surveyed as recently as 1850-51. Down here, they've made it by 1854, and it was broken into blocks. Now, the reason I show this is it is reflective. I'm going to make the case anyway, and suggest it is reflective of an attitude. Remember who's doing it, who's drawing it. Are these people that feel religiously related to the soil and the water and the trees? No. It's a very efficient system with repercussions that we still see today. What we see is, rather than settlement, as occurred during the Yokuts, settlement that reflected the natural changes in the land, rivers, production of the soil, where the Yokuts did change the land, but basically their settlement, their population directly reflected the natural environment. We're going to see a change beginning, starts slow, and then accelerates to the present, perhaps into the future, where settlement begins to be controlled by something other than the natural environment. Notice in this case, I just showed this satellite photo. This is taken back in 1977, how everything is conformed to that grid, falls into accordance. You know, checkerboard squares, canals, roads, settlement patterns. Again, I'm just emphasizing that now this is subconscious, but is this going to make our relationship stronger to the earth, or is it going to diminish our relationship when we begin to pay more attention to boundaries put up by surveyors? I think that the survey system psychologically would foster ideas that would favor uniformity over diversity. People began to see their part of nature within a box. If you came out and settled 160 acres, it was in a square. Obviously, we all know that the processes of land and life, the wind and animals and flow of water crosses these boundaries. However, people begin to see it as private property, their section. I feel that this framework of the survey helped to foster a preference for uniformity over diversity, and also an attempt to create uniformity where it didn't exist. If you didn't luck out and get a parcel of land that was rich as your neighbor, use technology, use labor to turn it into something that's more uniform, often at the expense of nature. Rather than adapt to the diversity like the Yokuts did, instead of adapting to the diversity, change it with tremendous skill, with tremendous knowledge, with tremendous access to energy and technology. Something else involved with this framework, we began to see land as a commodity. We began to see land more quantitatively rather than qualitatively. Quantitatively rather than qualitatively. The survey system was developed to extend democracy across the United States. You know, it was Jeffersonian concept of we should be a nation of small farmers. Thought that would be, thought that would be richer, make for a richer, healthier democracy. However, in some ways it did that, but in some others it didn't. Because of laws and failure to enforce certain laws, the setup of the survey system allowed for a great deal of land speculation. Many people benefited tremendously, especially small farmers on the eastern side. But as you know, a lot of this land was booked by people that didn't settle it. You know, speculators like we all are. Buy the land, hold it for a while. And what we see is over time, over a 100-year period of time, this kept a lot of people off the land. And we see most of the speculatory landscapes being in the western portion of the valley, the larger units. There's some environmental reasons too, but I'm going to suggest the survey system made it easier, because you didn't have to go out and stake it out. You could go to a land office, and if you had the money, buy this, 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 and this, and sit on it, wait for the price to come up. And I'm going to suggest that the framework, the rectangularity framework of the survey helped to foster this. Well, back to the story of human occupation. Indeed, the first American colonizers of the basin used it as a pasture. It was so far removed from modern forms of transport that they had to have protein on the hoof, and of course the pasture turned into a place to feed the gold fields of the north and also the burgeoning cities of Northern California, Stockton and San Francisco among them, Sacramento. And in the 1850s and 1860s, it turned into an enormous pasture. Some towns developed during this period that reflected this mode of economic adaptation. One in particular was Visalia. I mentioned Visalia because it was seated in one of the richest environments in the Cahuilla Fan. It was quite a cowboy town. This is a photograph taken in 1864. Like most of the early towns, it had about 100 bars. And it was definitely your cowboy type atmosphere. In fact, the 1860 census of this region found that over a third of the people had come from Arkansas, Texas, and Missouri, and the southeast. I mean, not southeast, but the Midwest. It was a very, very rich environment. However, some environmental fluctuations helped bring it down, this great pasture for sheep, and cows, and even horses. There were great floods and great droughts, specifically in the 1860s. Where in some cases in the flood of 1867, 1868, perhaps 2/3 of all the animals died. Also, there were changes coming. And this is one of the great changes, of course, throughout the valley. The railroad was coming. The railroad was up here before it came down there, but the railroad, these steel tendrils, the octopus, came down into the Tulare County by 1872. And what this is going to do, in terms of the processes that prove important for environmental change, of course, is to further tie in the valley to extra-regional processes. It's going to tie in the valley to the national culture. Before the railroad, there was some character in the valley. My students always complain that when you drive from Bakersfield to Redding, it's all the same. I argue against that, because they only stop McDonald's on all the way up there. Never Jack in the Box anymore, but they do. They do, and I don't believe, that I don't think we ought to lose sight that even the Americans that came here with different values, good ones too. They tried to measure up to standards of efficiency and profit and also dominion over the earth. They did very, very well. But in the days before the railroad, they often adapted slightly, subtlety to the environment. You found towns where you had river crossings, and you found towns where it was better watered. You found towns where you had better soils and better grass for the animals. In other words, there was somewhat of a reflection of the early settlement pattern. But when the railroad comes, it's going to change. It's going to change enormously, because the railroads are strong enough to ignore the givens of the environment, the differences in the environment. You could draw a line on a map and make that line happen on the ground by building the tracks. 1872, we lay them across the valley. The first tracks. This is not only going to have an economic change, but it's going to have a change in people's relationship to the earth as well. Towns were, the railroad was powerful enough to build a town and nurture it and keep it running until it got on its own feet. But the towns were placed not according to the vagaries of the natural environment, but according to the railroad. Of course, I had to throw this at you. Even the towns themselves had to conform to the tracks. You know, many of the downtowns, I even see it here, the streets are either parallel or perpendicular to the tracks. Kind of an imperial force. And if you read The Octopus by Frank Norris, you get enough of that word octopus, the steel tendrils. Of course, though, with the new transportation, we have a different type of person. Many of the people that were utilizing the basin as a pasture left. They left. Farmers were coming. And the farmers came in the 1870s and early 1880s. We had the great bonanza wheat period. At one time, 1884, 90% of the land in Tulare County was put into wheat. Most of this wheat was shipped to San Francisco and sold in Europe, already being influenced by extra-regional demands. Again, though, we see an emphasis, though, an emphasis among the people that's going to have its effect upon the natural environment. An emphasis for efficiency, the reliance upon technology, the reliance upon hired labor, the reliance upon outsiders for the very subsistence. In other words, with the railroad, most of the items of life, most of the necessities of shelter and nutrition actually were not grown there. Were not taken from the valley directly, but shipped in from elsewhere with the railroad. A dependence upon the outside world, which actually is not going to urge people to become closer to the environment. They become more divorced from it. With the ever-increasing inputs of technology and labor, we see people striving tirelessly to remove themselves from the constraints of the natural environment. When you have a seasonal change or when the rains don't come, that's going to affect your production. You have to do something about that. If you can, or you go broke. It only makes sense. And what we see is this process, if you want to look at it abstractly, is tirelessly trying to divorce yourself from the constraints to ensure productivity. And boy, was it productive. The valley was one of the most productive wheat growing places on earth in the 1870s and early 1880s. In order to ensure productivity, because of the, as it was described by some as fickle climate, some of the earliest irrigation began in the 1850s, but by the 1860s and 1870s, we began to divert the rivers of the basin, and we see this diversion occurring elsewhere in California. We also see a change in what's happening in terms of people's relationship to their surroundings. Can you imagine the Yokuts ever having a word for weed? Can you imagine the Yokuts ever having a word for pest? There were things that were preferred, but other things were basically neutral. Everything shared spirituality. When you graze cattle, there are things that are pests, right? There are predators out there. What do you do with predators? You eradicate them. And a lot of the large animals, like the bears, were no longer around by the early 1860s. When you're first starting out, you sometimes cull the animals for food. Not only were cattle shipped to the gold fields, but everything else that were running around if you could get them. There was a great harvesting of the various animals, the deer and the antelope. The last antelope shot in this vicinity was 1872. That's one thing to have animals, but then when you start planting crops and having chicken coops, other things are redefined as what? Pests and predators. And what do you do with them? It's what you would have to do if you're going to survive. You eradicate them. And what we see is another acceleration of simplification of the environment. Many things being taken off that old species list. Some things we don't even know about. But by the 1870s, easily the elk and the antelope were gone. The beaver were long gone. The mink were gone. The river otters were gone. Also, with the railroad nearby, people were able to harvest the lake, Tulare Lake. They're catching fish, using great seines that were 2 miles long, sometimes pulling in 2 tons of fish with great horses. They were shooting ducks and sending them to San Francisco, terrapin to San Francisco. They were catching the fish. But we're going to see something occurring here where, yeah, most of the people were employed as farmers, using this water to grow wheat, and later in the 1880s and 1890s, other types of crops. But we're going to see that one economic pursuit, irrigated agriculture, is going to lead to the demise of another. Because as they begin to divert that water, what happened to Tulare Lake? It began to shrink because the water's going elsewhere. When the lake began to shrink, what happened to the salinity of the lake? It began to build up. You can evaporate the water, salt stays behind. By 1890, the salmon, of course, were gone, and the trout were gone, and most of the more exploitable, favored species were gone. In fact, the lake began to be seen by the 1880s and 1890s as something other than a resource. Yeah, production from the lake began to be reduced, but as happened with the Yokuts, the first peoples that came and saw the Yokuts, especially the Americans, liked them. Very friendly people. Then the Yokuts began to be in the way of manifest destiny. Then there was a process of dehumanizing the Yokuts, calling them beasts of the field, calling them diggers, less than human. It's easier to remove them. Same thing happened to the lake. Something that was in the way of progress. In this case, the way of progress meant expanding wheat agriculture towards the lake basin. The lake was in the way. It began to be described in the 1880s and 1890s as a great morass, something ugly in a mud hole, and we have to get rid of it. They began attacking the lake by dredging and pinning it up like they did the Yokuts. Devalue it first and then pin it up. 1880s, more railroads came in. The basin soils, that rich alluvium that had washed down eons before from both the Coast Range and the Sierra Nevadas, no matter what you brought here, it seemed to work, from pumpkins to apricots to grapes to walnuts. And in the 1880s, because of economic changes elsewhere, because of competition in wheat from elsewhere on the world, people began to diversify. More railroads came, and the settlement structure continued to expand. More permanent housings. People that once just came here to graze animals or to grow wheat, to make their fortune, and then moved to San Luis Obispo, began to be replaced by people in the 1880s and 1890s that wanted a permanent home with diverse kind of agricultural pursuits. This is a sketch of a multi-use farm near Visalia. However, the more different crops you bring into a region, can you imagine you might come up with more pests? Things that were not a pest before began to really eye your crops, and they became a pest, and you wipe them out. This is some of the notorious rabbit drives. This is an indication of a renewed cycle of eradication of things that would attack your environmental niche. Tulare Lake. And this is a sketch in 1892, and that sketch in the upper part allows me to briefly go back to the Corcoran clay, that old lake bed of the Corcoran, old Lake Corcoran. As early as 1850s, people began to divert rivers for agricultural irrigation. And what that did was allow them to expand beyond the moist lands next to the streams and expand irrigated agriculture in the interlubes or out into the basin. However, that old lake began to help people move out there too, because the water was under pressure. That impermeable clay cap of the old Corcoran clay bed, hundreds of feet down, there was water flowing down ever so gently from the Sierra Nevadas, putting a lot of pressure there. And all you had to do was dig a hole, and the water would come flowing up by itself because it was under pressure, and they called this an artesian well. And for a while, that old ghost of Tulare Lake, the old great-grandfather of Tulare Lake, Corcoran Lake, began to help human occupation of the valley where you could go way beyond the canals and way beyond the rivers and bring diversified farming out into the lake basin just by poking a hole in the ground. These artesian wells allowed for settlement way out in the axis of the valley as late as anywhere where the Corcoran clay was underneath it, as late as the 1900s.
What towns are presently located in that area?
Tipton, Pixley, that's on the edge of the Corcoran clay. Corcoran, of course. My uncle lives outside Tipton, and he had an old artesian well. None of them are flowing, of course. Why? The pressure has been reduced because of the flow of the water. But it did serve us well for a while. I'm showing what happened was that a massive attack was taken on because of the good economic conditions of the 1880s, early 1890s. They began to dredge the lake, and this dredging continued into this century. And I have this old irrigation map, 1888, that shows even the lake shores began to conform to the rectangular grid, right? If you're going to build a levee, you align that levee according to the coordinates. And the lake began to disappear. In fact, they imprisoned it. It never quite would totally go away, but what they did was they allocated a reservation. They did. A certain township said, this is for the lake. And every once in a while you guys look on a map and you see that square piece of water out there. And sometimes it comes back, but when you devalue it, you pin it up, like we did the Yokuts, of course. This shows irrigated agriculture moving across the valley. We're intervening in 1922. By this time, the lake is dead. There's water, but there's no life in it, other than species that are undesirable. Now, there was this oscillation of the lake according to the drought and heavy moisture cycles, of course. By this time, there was a dense network of railroads throughout the basin. The lake didn't have any life because it was very salty, and that was a human alteration. By this time, most of the artesian wells had stopped flowing. About this time, though, settlement stops in terms of town founding in the basin. And it's due to the advent of something new on the landscape that begins coming in around the turn of the century. It's going to make railroad town founding unnecessary. And of course, it's the automobile age. The reason I throw this in is we find a direct correlation between the rising use of automobiles and absolute aborting any new towns, because now farmers can go out to their farms and move around. New railroads were not needed. But also I introduced this as a time when we began to really affect the atmosphere, right? And the ecology of the atmosphere. We often ignore the atmosphere, but the atmosphere is part of our biosphere. And begin to affect it in numerous ways, which I'll illustrate in a moment. Here's the road patterns. I really like this survey system, as you can tell. Of course, early roads, 1914, Tulare County had a notoriety. I used to tell my relatives this one, too. They were not impressed. In 1914, we, for a county, believe this, we had more paved roads than anybody else in the valley. We didn't beat LA, but in the valley. Whoopee. Okay. Unfortunately, we had the demise of the railroads.
Those cars were 30 cars, and that's 14 pictures.
It was a historical glitch. Thank you, though. How do you know those were not?
My wife told me.
Yeah. They're burning these old railroad cars outside Visalia. And I really think, what a pity. You know, you make a restaurant out of them or something. But the end of an era. By this time, by about the 1920s, of course, we had an ongoing process of simplification. In other words, the environmental attributes of the land were being diminished, but at the same time, productivity by human agricultural beings were increasing. But because the basin had always been tied into, especially during American occupation, extra-regional processes like changes in government laws and changes in worldwide economics, we're going to enter the period of the Depression with many, many changes that are going to occur. This is a map of irrigation, another anachronism here. Historically, this shows the spread of irrigation. But the trouble is, they began running out of local water supplies, and it began to be felt in the 1920s and 1930s. They had already diverted most of the rivers. The lake couldn't be used for water, it was too salty, plus you had to move the water uphill. The artesian wells had died, but by this time, because of new energy sources brought in from elsewhere, like steam and gasoline, people in the basin began to reverse gravity with wells. And by this time, they were pumping all over the place, using energy to pump some of the early wells. Trouble is, they were pumping out of groundwater aquifers. As early as 1920, they were pumping faster than the groundwater aquifers were being recharged, not without its consequences. Go back to that in a second. This is a map, 1939, of lowering of groundwater tables because of human alteration. Now, what happened here in the 1930s, because prices were low due to the Depression, oftentimes the pumping of groundwater lowered the water table beyond the financial reach of farmers. And when they no longer could pump it, it was over, and we had about an abandonment of about 20,000 acres in Tulare County because of dropping groundwater tables. But of course, as I showed up there, the 1930s, low prices, great migrations into the valley up here as well as down there by people from the Midwest, the great dislocations, economic hardships, resulting in labor strife, as so well depicted by The Grapes of Wrath and other novels from the Southern Valley. World War II kind of bailed us out, but from this point on, we're going to see less and less people making a living from the land. We're going to see, from this point on, from World War II on, a more emphasis upon technology, labor, but labor who don't own the land, essentially, and less people directly tied to the land. Because of the 30s, because of government programs, water was brought in from elsewhere. The great Frank Kern Canal, later, as you know, 69, 70, the Great California Aqueduct, importing water into the basin. This is an irrigation map. This shows a sequence of the basin from 1949, 1974. The stippled pattern shows the spread of irrigated agriculture, starting in the east and spreading and going all the way across. With the new water supply, the whole valley could be irrigated. With World War II, we began with the chemical age, meaning pesticides, herbicides, new ways for people to protect the crops, enhance production, fertilizers. Whereas before there were woodlots, there were canals, there were fence lines full of animals and remnants of the species of plants. Now with pesticides and herbicides and new chemicals, we could remove them as well. We see a dichotomy, especially after World War II, occurring between the west side and the east side. A lot of people in the southern part of the valley don't realize that the first orchards that were put in near Hanford and Lemoore. You know where those are? Yeah. Hanford and Lemoore way out there, that was the first orchards. We find because of water problems and also because of soil conditions, we get this change where the east side, this is near Lindsay, this is near Hanford, we get a change where Hanford begins to turn towards row crops at the expense of orchards. And the reason was row crops, you know, these things you plant every year, you can play the market better, cotton and sugar beets and things like this. Also, the water conditions out here were getting worse. And on the west side, on the east side with smaller farms, we see more permanence in the cropping, like walnuts and oranges and grapes and things like that. And we see the stippled pattern showing that kind of dichotomy. You don't see it so much up here, but in the southern part of the valley, it's really noticeable. The west side is the land of large farms. This is, I used to work for these people. This is Boswell Corporation near Corcoran. This is one of his tractor lots. Now, the reason I do this is to remember that we have factories on the farm out on the west side. There are people that know the land, but when you have a foreman, one of my friends that controls 5,000 acres, he doesn't really know the land like his predecessors. But so far, through inputs of technology, good management, and chemicals, the land has continued to produce. So this is the main crop down there today, irrigated cotton. This is the west side. I thought this was artistic because you got the cotton. Okay. This is the ego shot, the homogeneity of the west side. Safflower, full section fields, extremely productive, except not without a consequence. This spot where I'm standing is where the old lakeshore used to be. Imagine me with tules and bulrushes and elk and antelope and ducks clouding the skies and mosquitoes tearing me apart. And now that we have this simplification, extreme simplification, very productive as we perceive it. However, you have to ask yourself, and I can't answer it, is it better? Is this a natural adaptation to the land out there, or are there subsidies? Do we force feed this kind of agriculture, and is it the best kind of agriculture to have out there? It might be the only kind. Is it going to last forever? There's some doubts. This is on the Tulare Lake bed again. Remember, the given ecology out there says it's a basin within a basin. It's internal drainage. The water that evaporates stays there. What stays behind? Salt. You know, the old salinization problem. Also, you have this problem elsewhere, of course, when you focus and concentrate the drainage waters from some agricultural fields, especially on top of that Corcoran clay. That won't, Corcoran clay and other lenses, even higher than that perches the water table. The salt water will build back up and towards the root zone. If it reaches the root zone, it can be horrendous. You have to drain that water out. Where do you drain it? You might drain it into places like Kesterson or in evaporation ponds. I have a friend that has a farm. He uses 10% of his land for an evaporation pond because he can't get the water out because the drain is not finished or it's not going to be built or something like that to get the water in your San Joaquin River here. But it's basic physics. It's basic physics. About, for every acre of the west side, about a ton of salt is applied through irrigation water every year. 1 ton per acre per year. It's basic physics. How long can this go on? My dad used to farm this field. This is the consequence of salinization. Yeah, there's a geography to salinization. Places outside the Corcoran clay on the east side, water can percolate down. You could purge the topsoils of salt. Remember, you're putting water in a desert. This is the west side where the water tends to perch. And that means it evaporates and keeps capillarity action, brings it back to the surface of the soil and leaves the salt. Yeah?
It looks like that's currently being
They're trying to bring it.
Used. I mean, can anything grow in soil that's that salty?
Yeah. Believe it or not. Nothing I want to eat, but you can put gypsum on it. You can treat these. It's very expensive, and they'll often put forage on it. But you know, they're trying to recondition these soils. This is another, you can see where it is worked. It is showing the hand of humans right now. The reason I showed this was this land used to be more productive. Nobody spoiled this land on purpose just by an effort to make a living, but using a process that's incompatible with a given environment, you're going to change it, sometimes for the detriment. It's estimated that today that there's about 1 million acres, about one irrigated acre out of 6 is now being diminished in terms of its productivity, despite the inputs of pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers. I'd like to ask you whether we sort of reinforce this. Some people suggest that maybe this should be turned to other land use practices, but I'm not unaware that people are making a living off this land too. In other words, I was talking about subsidized water and subsidized crops. I mean, we have a hand in it. The salinization has its other repercussions, of course. Waterfowl that land in Kesterson, waterfowl that land in my good friend's evaporation pond, selenium building up, argon, boron. Remember, this is basically an affliction of the west side. Another problem that's occurring, of course, another change in the natural ecology, not on purpose, but it's happening, is land subsidence. We're changing the basic geomorphology. We're changing the geology. When you pump water from aquifers, the aquifer will often collapse. In other words, you're taking the water from between the sand grains and it collapses. And a lot of these lands have dropped now over 30 feet because you're over pumping. Now, not without its cultural consequences. Well casings, canals, laser leveled fields have to be re-lasered leveled in order to get the water to flow right because you're having this subsidence occurring. Roads that were built, I lost a spoiler on one of these to shed the water, and now because the roads subside a little bit because of withdrawal of groundwater, it ponds. Kind of dangerous sometimes. I like this map. This is where the top of the land used to be in 1955. Yeah, and it's continuing, of course. We need that groundwater. Half the water used in the valley is groundwater. We always see the visual canals, but half the water is groundwater. We're dependent upon it. The east side is still more diverse. Relying upon, again, the old determinants of successful agriculture in the valley, energy, market, farming as a business. The valley is a great arena of agribusiness, right? It's a great arena of agribusiness and extremely productive. The most productive irrigated landscape on Earth. Relying heavily upon reworking the land, making it change. If the climate's not quite right, what do? Change the climate. The soils aren't quite right, change the soils. If you don't have water there naturally, get water there. And this place keeps on responding favorably. I think this adds it all up. Look around. This is domination. The Yokuts adapted to this landscape by discovering its natural capabilities. We settle this landscape by conquering it. And it works. Those are tomatoes near the town of Yedem in northern Tulare County. You got water, orchard heater, windmill in the back, little caps, very intensive. Did we change the atmosphere? Have some of you complained about the old swamp coolers no longer working? We got some. I'm not going to ask you, I'm going to ask your wife. Do you remember the swamp coolers? They were great. They used to work, right? Evaporative coolers. And then nobody has them anymore. I tell my students, and they go, boy, you must have been born in the Pleistocene. But actually, the valley is becoming more humid. Does it make sense? We're spreading the water out for evaporation, right? Also transpiration from different crops, but irrigation is raising the humidity. What I meant by the evaporative cooler, when the air becomes more moist, it's harder to evaporate moisture off your skin, and that, it's harder to cool yourself. So they don't work. And we've seen that happen quite rapidly. And there is a correlation between the rise of relative humidity in the valley, although, compared to New Orleans, it's very dry here, okay? I'm not going to... But we are changing it. Do you think changing the atmosphere could affect what could grow on the ground? Could we change conditions for mildew? Could we change conditions for plants and animals? It's hard to determine that, but I'm sure that we are. The settlement structure, the last land use, of course, is the urban occupation. I understand ag enrollment here is going down a little bit. It's kind of reflective of fewer and fewer people working on the land. And I'm going to suggest it's not bad. I no longer want to chop cotton myself. But on the other hand, the less people working on the land, basically the less people that are directly engaged with it, therefore the less constituents that land has in order to protect it. In other words, less people involved with the land, perhaps, the less concern for it. What's the percentage for the United States dealing directly with the land? About 2% of our population. I'm suggesting that as we turn more to a manufacturing society, a service society, we continue to strive to divorce ourselves, and it's an ongoing trend, our lives and our livelihoods from the natural environment, albeit we're more dependent upon it than ever. Even though we give lip service to liking nature, in our hearts and in our souls and in our minds, we're not part of nature. We can't be. I'm not. I claim to be an ecologist, but in my soul, I'm not. I'm above it. And yet, we better watch ourselves. This last occupation may be the final ceiling as this new investment zone, this new arena, not only for agriculture, but for investment, for industry, and I guess you guys are in the commuter belt of the East Bay. We're spreading that urban landscape, and it's homes for many of us, but at what price? I kind of abstractly showed a map showing intensive agriculture in this color, the spreading urban regions with this arrow, and the spread of corporate farms. Notice my adherence to the grid, spreading this way. But the natural environment continues to be lost. The flyaway, the great flyaway I alluded to before, in 1970, they were talking about 10 million ducks. In 1984, 2 million ducks landing. Many of the other species, the eyes are fairly vacant these days. You can still see a few flights. They're going down very rapidly. Urbanization eats up 55,000 acres in the valley, not only in the basin, but 55,000 acres every 12 months of land. Land that's been altered, but this is sealing it, essentially. How long can it go on? How long will it continue to produce? Now, we're altering an already altered landscape. We're altering something else. I mentioned it started, of course, with kind of the industrial age. Probably people were polluting the air a little bit back in the late part of the last century. But now with the burgeoning populations dependent upon gasoline, of course, we get this backlash. I mentioned that high pressure zone earlier that gives us this wonderful sunny skies in the summertime that is the basis for our intense agricultural potential here. In other words, sunshine. 90% of the summers are sunny here in the valley. But that high pressure, which keeps all the clouds away, also does something else. Puts a lid. In other words, for rising air, you know, like how LA is hermetically sealed by what's called an inversion layer. And what we have is that high pressure during our warmer period is putting a lid over the valley, and this valley is a bathtub, right? And the more things we inject into it, often if conditions are right and that high pressure is very strong, it holds everything in. Ozone, asbestos, nitrogen oxides, sulfur oxides, and we don't know what kind of repercussions this is going to have on agricultural production. We know it's affecting it. Ozone scars on leaves. Maybe there's scars on our lungs. But again, we didn't do this on purpose. We just did it trying to make a living and occupy the valley, but perhaps this is working against us. So, there's the valley, one of the most altered landscapes on Earth, showing the mark of human beings writ large across its landscapes. The Petri dish that I cherish so much. And how long will this cherished landscape go on attending to the wishes of us? How long will it go? We pin up. Does anybody know the names of these things? There are legacies on the valley floor. These are what we'll call Mima mounds.
What?
Mima mounds, M-I-M-A. They're leftovers from the Pleistocene. Most of them have been leveled. There's great controversies over whether rodents made these or periglacial effects of some sort or another. This is a zone right outside Tulare that the Nature Thank you. Nature Conservancy is saved. And again, pin it up. You go see nature, right? You don't live in amongst it. This is Kauai Oaks outside Visalia, where you can still see elements of the old aquatic and vegetative environment. Nature Conservancy, once again, is pinned off this area. It's really neat. Again, I think it's important to take your children to go see these things because they're stories that you can wrap our past around. They're tangible things on the land rather than statistics and words in a book that you can wrap stories around of human occupation of the earth. And it can show us what it was once like. And you can't tell where we're going until you know where we were, right? I think that's what my mom said. You got to know, you got to see ourselves in a trend and an ongoing process. And the only way to really show that ongoing process is to find remnants of the past. Get anchored to it, see where we're going, and perhaps we can make some useful decisions on maybe nudging us in different pathways. You can still see some aspects of the fauna component of the valley. This is back in buttonwillow with the Tule elk, but again, you've got to go to a certain place, very divorced from us and protected. You can still find a few things that have escaped. This is the canal. These are old tules and bulrushes. You have more up here than we have down there. Every once in a while, you see a standing giant. It's a legacy of the past, but everything's been homogenized around its base. The wonderful, wonderful soils of the San Joaquin. If you look hard and you're sensitive, and if you read the inspired words of writers to help you flesh out the past and what was, you can still find it. Unfortunately, sometimes you only find it in our cultural manifestations. This is a lakeside bar. There's no lake there anymore. But if you look hard, you drive around. Jeff. There it is. They're still our legacies. Thank you very much. You do remember swamp coolers, right? Tell me you do.
Was this taking place in the valley, essentially the same pace up and down through the valley?
Oh,
Other than
different
childhood
pace.
intimidation, what sparked your interest in history and geography?
You know, that insecurity that I had and low self-esteem as a child.
So you would recommend that geographers all have low self-esteem and insecurity?
Although one afflicted by valley fever, I think. I think the other aspect of, I was a listener as a child and I listened to stories, but I'm very visual and I wanted to flesh out visually these landscapes that all these histories were taking place upon. In other words, I couldn't imagine what was going on because everything was so altered. And I began trying to flesh it out in my mind's eye, what was out there, the context. You know, a good director knows the stage is important to a play, right? The stage, the environment. And we know that as a geographer, the stage influences the play. The play influences the environment. The other aspect was my mother loved trees. And my dad, every time his self-esteem was low, would cut down a tree. And I remember my mother hugging trees and crying, but Dad, that tree's got to go, it's a trash tree. And I sort of went with my mother on that one, and I think that planted some seeds.
What do you feel is the approximate lifespan of the agriculture in the Central Valley? Asking to be clairvoyant here.
In some places, I think for hundreds of years, despite some of my worries about some of the lands being overused and salinization and poor land use practices, there are many examples, especially in the small farm regions of the eastern part of the valley, with agriculture that's fairly sustainable. But I would suggest that this is not my examination, but my reading, that much of the west side, if we look elsewhere on Earth and see the rates of salinization that we're seeing today and soil depletion, that maybe a third of the valley out of production in 40 years. 40. The reason I say that is physics, salt buildup, perhaps, but there's lots of things you can't predict, like changing economies of scale and changing economics and demands, changing in laws. And we might see it not go out totally, but go back to grazing. In other words, we have this faith in perpetual progress, but on some cases, and I think we see it in Africa and elsewhere nowadays, where we have some rolling back of progress. Because again, we can bridge, we can input, pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers to prop that land production up and up and up for a while. For how long? And I think we're already seeing some of the backlash occurring. So,
Does that 1/3 include the land taken up by urbanization, or just the land that's going to production because of salinization, etc.?
that was not being covered by urbanization. That, you could argue that term, that I don't hang on it. But I'm just thinking the west side, where would it be geographically? The west side and further south in the valley. The southern part of the valley, you have many advantages up here because you do drain to the sea. I have the references on that, where I got that statistic that I can give you later.
Are you aware Stanislaus County has the lowest percentage of irrigated cropland with salinity problems in the San Joaquin Valley? And should this farmland not be protected from urbanization?
No and yes. I wasn't aware of that. Where do your salts go?
At least out from irrigation.
Into the river.
Where?
At least out of the river for over 100 years. That's why we have the lowest salt
Yeah.
percentage of it.
Fairly, it stays pretty low, pretty even, right? I think that's wonderful. Not without its consequences. The salmon run's the same,
Those salmon only have 2 canals.
but I think it may be a price worth paying. I'm not saying, I could always come up with a consequence because I'm an ecologist, and I know that environmental impact is historically accumulative and ecologically interrelated. And I think that's wonderful. I mean, compared to Tulare and Kings County, we can look up to you in that regard. The savings of agricultural land? Yeah, but I wrote that map of the cities that I had up there, the black splotches, and I went to the Board of Supervisors in Tulare County, and they were so used to using statistics, and there was this Williamson Act, I believe it was Williamson Act of preserving agricultural land, which I really liked. My uncles and everything got involved in it, and preserving agricultural land. But on the other hand, my uncle wants to sell his land. He wants to make $1 million, and it makes sense. He's next to a city. And he feels when I talk like that, and I'm intervening in his right to make even it to meet the standards of profit and meet the standards of efficiency. He wants his son to continue farming. His son's not going to do it. Do I have the right to intervene in that process and say, you can't sell that land, you've got to keep it in agriculture? I have a real problem with that. However, I showed that map to up there, and then I showed him a map of LA Basin in 1920. And LA used to be made up of all these small towns growing together. And then I just said, you better look at this. And then I took the rates of growth of urban expansion and I proceeded it into the next millennia. And in that very area around Tulare and Visalia and Hanford, it just closed up with urbanization. And I said, you guys, you just really love growth, and that's growth. That's growth as we know it. But at what price? They've been looking at statistics. When they saw it spatially, it sobered up the crowd briefly. They were saying, we hope to have 7% growth in urban services and expansion into the next century. At what consequence? And many of the supervisors saying, I grew up in a small rural town, I want that for my children, but at the same time they wanted this kind of growth. But you can understand both sides. But I think that most of us don't pay attention to both sides, and I think that more reasonable planning decisions can be made by looking at both sides. Yeah, I'm in favor of protecting farmland, but
Let your uncle know.
if they lay me off at Cal Poly, I may have to work for him. I'm not sure of how to do it.
Well, this is sort of in the same vein as the valley could become a giant suburb the way San Jose has built the Santa Clara Valley. How can we avoid it? Your suggestion.
Land trust?
Doing it up Marin and doing it in other places.
I think educate people to the necessity of open lands. I think, set up the attitude first. I mean, you can make land trusts today, yes, of course, but people usually are not aware of context. In other words, most people don't know how much is being eaten up. They keep on saying there's plenty out there. And I think that we ought to remind people what's happening and maybe the importance of continuing a lifestyle we all cherish by preserving agricultural land. I don't want my tax money back. I wouldn't mind having my tax money go to the smaller farmers around the towns and they say, I want to sell out. How about if we give you more money to stay there? I'd rather give it to the small farmers living in a closer relationship to the land and perhaps use my tax money as leverage for saving farmland, okay? And yeah, at the expense of who? My old employer, Boswell, who lives in LA and flies in on a Learjet once in a while. He's a good man. But on the other hand, I'd rather force feed, if I'm going to use my tax money, the preservation of land than the ruination. And what I meant by that was force feeding salinization through water subsidies. I don't want that money back, just shove it over to the east side of the valley where we have the expanding urban zones and see if we can put people back on the land and preserve it. Big.
Okay, this will be the last question. How do you foresee the conflicts between environmental groups and farmers in urban areas being resolved with regards to finite water supply?
Urban versus farms.
Environmental groups.
Environmental
and
groups.
Farmers in urban areas.
What?
Having to do with the water.
What? With
Yeah.
The finite water supply. How do you decide where water goes, I guess, maybe.
Well, about 84% used in agriculture. I would suggest that we realize that the environmentalists and the farmers are on the same side of the coin. We polarize so quickly. I'm an environmentalist, but I also help my uncle farm, and I like seeing birds in the air, but I want to see his farm continue too. And I want to see my water in San Luis Obispo, but I want to see water for him. We are so wasteful that we could address it through conservation. I know it's an old, tired suggestion. Our habits are extremely wasteful. We've made great strides in some parts of conservation and the use of energy, but there are many examples all over the world we can learn from. And I think the best thing to do is just see us all, it's not separate sides of the coin, it's the same side. And I think if we start there, start by listening first, and then show that we both want the same thing. We want to sustain life on this land. And then maybe we could listen to each other. And I'm hoping that, in other words, we can provide a base through education. And I don't think you can approach it any other way, because it'll be an adversarial relationship. And when you have somebody telling you to change, you bring down the plexiglass. And I think that we only change when we see it as personally beneficial. And we have to educate the people and begin to realize that it's personally beneficial to allocate water more sanely, more rationally, and to conserve it.
Thank you very much, Bill.
Thanks for listening.